She was the village plague, the girl who survived the winter fever when half the settlement perished. They whispered she traded their souls for her own. So when the feral king demanded his decennial tithe, handing over the cursed girl, solved two problems at once. They expected her to be torn apart in the fighting pits. What they didn't expect was the ruthless ruler of the northern wastes dropping to his knees in the mud, paralyzed by the scent of his only mate. Rain lashed against the warped wooden slats of Gwyneth's cabin, a relentless drumming that matched the hollow ache in her stomach. She sat close to the meagre hearth, her hands stained dark with the juice of elderberries and the soot of the fire. At 22, Gwyneth knew the shape of isolation better than the contours of her own face. The village of Oak Hill lay just down the muddy embankment, but it might as well have been across an ocean. They called her cursed. When the rot took the barley crop 5 years ago, they pointed at her. When the miller's son fell into the freezing river, they claimed she had looked at him with the evil eye. The truth was far more mundane, yet entirely unacceptable to the terrified peasants. Gwyneth was simply resilient. She survived the pox that took her mother. She survived the starvation winter that claimed her father. In a world where death was the only constant, a woman who refused to die was a witch. A sharp pounding on her door shattered the quiet. Before she could rise, the door was kicked open, its rusted hinges shrieking in protest. Wind and rain swept into the single-room hovel, killing her fire instantly. Harland, the village elder, stood in the doorway. Water dripped from his heavy woolen cloak. Behind him stood two men she recognized as the baker's brothers, clutching pitchforks with white-knuckled grips. They looked at her not with anger, but with a deep, primal terror. "Get up, Gwyneth." Harland grunted, his voice barely carrying over the storm. She didn't move. She kept her hands in her lap, her eyes locked on the old man's boots. "The tithe has come," she said, her voice flat. It wasn't a question. King Garrick's riders are in the square. They want a tithe of flesh this year, labor for the winter keep. 2 men and 3 women. Harland shifted his weight, refusing to meet her gaze. "You're one of the women." Gwyneth let out a dry, humorless laugh. "You're giving me to the Lycans." "We are giving you to the crown," Harland corrected, though his trembling jaw betrayed his false authority. "Pack nothing. They don't allow it. You leave now." She stood slowly. She didn't scream or fight. Fighting was for people who believed they had a chance of winning. She smoothed down the front of her rough-spun dress, stepped over the cold ashes of her hearth, and walked out into the freezing rain. The baker's brothers flanked her immediately, their weapons angled toward her ribs as if she might suddenly sprout fangs and tear their throats out. The village square was a sea of mud and terrified faces. The villagers stood huddled under the eaves of the tavern, and the smithy their eyes cast downward. In the center of the muck sat 5 massive war horses, black as pitch and heavily armored. Atop them sat the king's men. They were enormous, their shoulders impossibly broad beneath chainmail and thick furs. These were not mere soldiers. They were wolves wearing human skin. Gwyneth was shoved forward by Harland. She stumbled in the mud, catching herself on her hands. The icy slush seeped into her fingernails. The lead rider, a scarred brute with half his left ear missing, looked down at her. His nose twitched. He smelled her fear, or perhaps the complete lack of it. "This one," he rumbled, his voice like grinding stones. "She looks half-starved. The king needs strong backs, old man, not skin and bones. She's stronger than she looks, Captain Cedric." Harland stammered, bowing so low his nose nearly touched the slop. "She survived the winter fever. She doesn't get sick. She'll work harder than any 3 men. Cedric leaned forward over his saddle, his amber eyes locked onto Gwyneth. She stared back. The rain plastered her dark hair to her cheeks, but she didn't blink. She knew what they were doing. The village was purging its bad luck, feeding the monster the poison they couldn't stomach themselves. "Fine," Cedric barked. He gestured to a large wooden cart chained to the back of the last horse. 2 teenage boys and 2 other young women were already huddled inside, weeping quietly. Throw her in. We ride for Ironhold. Gwyneth climbed into the cart unassisted. She found a corner and pulled her knees to her chest. As the cart lurched forward, rattling over the uneven cobblestones, she didn't look back at the village. She knew no one was watching her go. They were already locking their doors, relieved that the curse had finally been lifted from their cursed soil. The journey north took 4 grueling days. The rain turned to sleet, and the sleet to snow. The landscape transformed from sparse woodlands to jagged, unforgiving mountains. Gwyneth barely spoke. She shared her meagre rations of hardtack and frozen water with a weeping girl named Clara, who spent the entire journey praying to gods that Gwyneth knew had long ago abandoned this land. "They'll eat us." Clara sobbed on the 3rd night, shivering violently under a thin, lice-ridden blanket. "They say the king drinks blood from a silver chalice." "If he wanted to eat us, he would have let us freeze out here." Gwyneth replied softly, her voice raspy from the cold. "Dead meat is easier to chew. We're going to work, that's all. Scrubbing floors, hauling ash. It's just a different kind of dying." Clara looked at her horrified by the bluntness. But Gwyneth had no comfort to offer. False hope was a cruelty she refused to inflict. You survived by looking the axe in the blade, not by pretending it was a feather. Ironhold loomed out of the blizzard like a jagged black tooth, piercing the white sky. It wasn't a castle of glass and tapestries. It was a fortress built for war, carved directly into the side of a granite mountain. The walls were thick, defensive, and scarred by centuries of sieges. Massive iron gates groaned open as Cedric's party approached, revealing a sprawling courtyard swarming with soldiers, hounds, and armourers. Gwyneth's muscles screamed in protest as she was hauled out of the cart. Her legs gave way, but she forced herself upright, refusing to kneel in the slush. The sheer scale of the place was overwhelming. The air smelled of wood smoke roasting meat-wet fur and the metallic tang of hot steel. Inside the main keep, King Garrick stared out the frosted glass of his solar, his massive hands braced against the stone sill. He was a man composed entirely of hard lines and barely contained violence. A decade of ruling the northern wastes had stripped him of whatever youth or mercy he once possessed. His dark hair was tied back, and a thick, jagged scar ran from his collarbone to his jaw. His wolf was silent. It had been silent for years. Among lichens, the beast within was a living, breathing companion. It possessed instincts, desires, and a terrifying capacity for love and rage. But Garrick's wolf had retreated deep into his psyche, buried under the weight of endless wars and the political machinations of his court. The elders whispered that a king without his wolf was unstable, unfit to rule. They pushed treaties and alliances at him, parading high-born lichen females through his halls in hopes of sparking a mate bond. Garrick rejected them all. He had no time for the fragile egos of pampered aristocrats. He needed soldiers, not a queen. "The tithe from the southern borders has arrived, Your Grace," an aide announced from the doorway, bowing stiffly. Garrick didn't turn around. "Send them to the quartermaster. Assess the strong ones for the smithies, the weak ones to the kitchens." "Captain Cedric reports a poor haul, sire. Famine in Oak Hill. They sent a woman they claim is cursed just to be rid of her." Garrick let out a bitter breath. "Humans and their superstitions. If she can scrub a pot, I don't care if she worships demons. See to it." "Yes, sire." The aide left. Garrick rubbed the bridge of his nose, feeling a familiar migraine blooming behind his eyes. He needed air. The castle felt stifling, smelling of old parchment and the cloying perfumes of the visiting lords. He threw a heavy wolf-pelt cloak over his shoulders and headed for the courtyard. The wind howled as Garrick stepped out into the biting cold. He welcomed the sting on his face. He walked past the training rings, nodding curtly to his soldiers. He was making his way toward the armory when he hit an invisible wall. It wasn't physical. It was sensory. A scent punched through the smells of dung smoke and sweat with the force of a battering ram. It was sharp and sweet, like crushed pine needles ozone right before a lightning strike, and something uniquely, terrifyingly human. For the first time in 10 years, the beast inside Garrick clawed its way to the surface. Mine. The word echoed in his skull, not a thought, but a tectonic shift in his very biology. Garrick stopped dead. His hands clenched into fists, his knuckles popping. His amber eyes flared into a luminescent predatory gold. His chest heaved, his lungs expanding as they greedily pulled in the scent. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. The civilized, cynical king was instantly smothered by the primal, possessive frenzy of the alpha. He turned his boots, crunching violently against the frozen gravel. Across the courtyard, Cedric was organizing the new tithe. 5 shivering humans stood in a miserable line. Garrick stalked toward them, parting the sea of soldiers and servants simply by his sheer terrifying presence. The murmurs in the courtyard died. The silence that fell was absolute, broken only by the howling wind. Garrick reached the line of humans. The 2 teenage boys fell to their knees, weeping. The weeping girl, Clara, fainted dead away into the mud. Garrick didn't look at them. His burning gaze was locked on the last figure in the line. She was filthy. Her dress was little more than a rag soaked through with icy mud. Her dark hair hung in matted strings around a pale, sharp-featured face. She was shivering so hard her teeth clicked, but she was standing. She wasn't looking at his boots. She was looking right into his eyes. Gwyneth stared at the giant of a man approaching her. He moved like a predator, closing in on a kill, his focus so intense it felt like a physical weight crushing her chest. She saw his eyes, not human eyes, but the glowing, fractured gold of a monster. He stopped less than a foot from her. He was massive, blocking out the sun, blocking out the wind. Garrick's chest rose and fell rapidly. He leaned down, his face inches from her freezing neck. He inhaled deeply, a ragged, shuddering breath that sounded like a dying man finding oxygen. Gwyneth stiffened her survival instinct, screaming at her to run, but her legs were rooted to the ground. She expected him to bite her. She expected the pain. Instead, she felt the ghost of his breath against her skin. "What is your name?" Garrick demanded. His voice was a low, terrifying rumble that vibrated through the frozen ground and directly into her bones. She swallowed hard-tasting grit and rain. "Gwyneth," she croaked. Garrick's jaw clenched. The wolf inside him was thrashing, howling, demanding he take her shield, her kill anyone in the courtyard who dared look at her. He fought it. He was a king, a rational man, not a mindless beast. But as he looked at this fragile, dirty human woman, the cynic in him shattered. "Cedric," Garrick barked, never breaking eye contact with Gwyneth. "Sire." Cedric stepped forward, visibly shaken by the king's bizarre behavior. "Take the others to the kitchens." Garrick finally straightened up his towering frame, casting a long shadow over her. "This one comes with me." Gwyneth's stomach dropped. "I can work," she said quickly, the words tumbling out in a panic. "I'm a hard worker. I don't—" "You don't speak." Garrick interrupted, his voice tight with the supreme effort of controlling his instincts. "You walk." He turned on his heel, his cloak snapping in the wind, expecting her to follow. When she didn't move immediately, 2 guards stepped forward to grab her. A low, savage snarl ripped from Garrick's throat. He spun back, his fangs fully descended, baring them at his own men. The guards scrambled backward, their hands raised in submission. "No one touches her!" Garrick said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. He looked at Gwyneth, the gold in his eyes, swirling with a terrifying intensity. "Walk." Shadows stretched long and deep across the stone floors of the king's private solar. It was a massive circular room dominated by a roaring fireplace and a heavy oak desk covered in maps and missives. Gwyneth stood near the heavy iron-bound door, dripping muddy water onto the thick Mayorish carpets. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stop the violent tremors shaking her body. She was going to die here. The village was right. She was cursed, and this was the end of the line. The feral king was going to tear her apart in the privacy of his chambers. Garrick paced to the far end of the room. He moved with a restless, caged energy running a heavy hand over his jaw. He was arguing with himself entirely silent. The mate bond was a legend, a romanticized biological imperative that the poets sang about, but reality was rarely so neat. He was an immortal lichen king. She was a starving, fragile human whose lifespan was a mere blink. And yet the scent of her was driving him insane. Every time she shivered, his wolf snarled, demanding he wrap her in furs and burn the world down to keep her warm. "They say you're cursed," Garrick said abruptly. He stopped pacing and leaned against his desk, crossing his thick arms. He forced his eyes back to their normal, stormy grey, though the effort caused a vein to throb at his temple. Gwyneth scoffed a defensive sound that surprised even her. "I'm not cursed. I'm just stubborn." "Your village elder claimed death follows you." "Death follows everyone, my lord. I just happen to be the one left standing when it passes. If that makes me a witch, then burn me and be done with it. Stop playing games." Garrick's eyebrows rose. A human telling an Alpha King to stop playing games. She was either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish. Or broken. He recognized the shattered look in her eyes. It was the same look he saw in the mirror every morning. "I don't burn witches," he said softly. He pushed off the desk and walked slowly toward her. Gwyneth pressed her back against the thick wood of the door, her chin tilting up defensively as he approached. He stopped just out of arm's reach. He could see the pulse hammering frantically at the base of her throat. "Are you hungry?" he asked. The question threw her off balance. She blinked, her tough facade slipping for a fraction of a second. "What? Are you hungry, Gwyneth?" He repeated, his voice losing its harsh, commanding edge. Yes. I haven't eaten a full meal since the snow started." She cursed herself for answering honestly, for showing weakness. But the man was disarming her in ways she couldn't predict. Garrick walked to a side table, where a servant had left a tray of roasted fowl hard cheeses and dark bread. He picked up a plate, piled it high, and carried it back to her. He held it out. Gwyneth stared at the food. Her stomach cramped violently at the smell, but she didn't take it. "What is the price?" she asked, her voice flat. "I've lived long enough to know that nothing is given for free. Not by villagers and certainly not by kings. You pulled me out of the line. You brought me here. Why—" Garrick looked at her hand hovering hesitantly near the plate. She was covered in dirt, her skin bruised and raw. He had spent his life surrounded by sycophants who would murder their own kin for a fraction of his attention, and here was a starving human refusing food because she didn't trust his motives. "Because my wolf wants to tear this castle apart if I let you out of my sight," Garrick said, deciding on brutal honesty. He watched her eyes widen in shock. "Because when I walked into that courtyard, a decade of silence ended. I don't know you, Gwyneth. I don't know if you're cursed or a witch or just a stubborn human. But you are my mate." The word hung in the air heavy and suffocating. Gwyneth let out a harsh, disbelieving breath. "No, that's a myth. A story mothers tell their pups. I'm human. I'm a tithe. I'm dirt." "You are my mate," Garrick repeated, stepping closer. The gold flickered in his eyes again, refusing to be suppressed. "And if you call yourself dirt again, I will have the tongues of the villagers who taught you to hate yourself cut out." The sheer violence in his promise made her flinch. "You can't claim me," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I won't be a pet. I won't be some magical cure for a broken king. I just want to live." Garrick reached out. He moved slowly, deliberately, giving her time to pull away. When her back hit the door and she had nowhere left to go, he gently cupped her face. His hand was massive, calloused and radiating heat. The contrast between his lethal strength and the incredible gentleness of his touch shattered the last of her defensive walls. A single tear slipped down her dirty cheek. Garrick caught the tear with his thumb. The contact sent a jolt of electricity straight to his chest, locking the mate bond into place, with the finality of a steel vault slamming shut. "You aren't a cure, Gwyneth," Garrick murmured, leaning down until his forehead rested lightly against hers. He breathed her in, grounding himself in the reality of her presence. "And I don't want a pet. You want to live, then live. But you do it here. With me. Because if you leave, I think my chest might actually cave in." She closed her eyes, the warmth of him seeping into her freezing bones. She had spent her entire life being pushed away, labelled a pariah, treated like a disease. Now the most dangerous creature in the northern wastes was standing before her, trembling with the desperate need to simply be near her. "Eat," Garrick ordered softly, stepping back just enough to let her breathe, though his hand remained on her cheek. "Eat, bathe, and rest. We have a long night ahead of us." Gwyneth looked at the plate still in his other hand. She was terrified. The cynic in her screamed that this was a trap, that the morning would bring reality crashing back down. But as she looked up into Garrick's eyes, seeing not a monster but a man as lonely and exhausted as she was, she slowly reached out and took the food. Steam curled off the surface of the scalding water, thick with the scent of dried chamomile and pine soap. Gwyneth sat perfectly still on a velvet-cushioned stool, staring at the massive copper tub occupying the center of the adjoining washroom. Two female servants, older women with kind eyes and greying hair, stood nearby holding thick linen towels and waiting for her command. Nobody had ever waited on her. In Oak Hill, if you couldn't draw your own water, you died of thirst. "You can leave," Gwyneth said, her voice raspy. The taller servant bowed her head. "His Grace instructed us to scrub your back, my lady, to ensure you are warm." "I am warm. I can wash myself." Gwyneth didn't mean to sound harsh, but the panic bubbling in her throat made her words sharp. Being clean was a luxury, but being vulnerable around strangers was a death sentence. "Please, just leave the soap." The servants exchanged a brief glance before bowing again and retreating, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind them. Alone, Gwyneth stripped off the damp, filthy rags that had served as her only clothing for the past 3 years. She dropped them onto the stone floor with a wet slap. Catching her reflection in a polished bronze mirror, she forced herself to look. She was a map of hard years. Her ribs pressed sharply against pale skin, her collarbones jutted out like fragile bird wings, and a mosaic of faded bruises and silver scars crisscrossed her arms and thighs. She didn't look like a mate to a king. She looked like a stray dog that had been kicked one too many times. Stepping into the water, she gasped as the heat sank into her freezing muscles. She scrubbed her skin raw, scraping away the mud of the journey, the soot of her hovel, and the clinging stench of the village that had discarded her. She washed her hair until the water turned grey, then drained it and refilled the tub from the iron boiler, washing again until she felt like a raw nerve. When she finally emerged wrapped in a linen towel, she found fresh garments waiting on the bed. They were not the silken gowns of a high-born lady, but practical, beautifully made clothes. Soft wool trousers, a thick cotton tunic, dyed deep forest green, and a fur-lined vest. Garrick had paid attention. He didn't try to dress her up like a doll. He dressed her to survive the mountain cold. She stepped back into the main solar. The roaring fire had warmed the massive room to a comfortable baseline. Garrick was sitting in a heavy leather chair by the hearth, staring into the flames. He wore a simple black tunic, his thick hair damp, indicating he had bathed elsewhere while she occupied his quarters. He didn't turn around immediately, giving her a moment to acclimate. "Does it fit?" he asked, his voice a low rumble over the crackling logs. "It's warm," Gwyneth replied, cautiously, hovering near the doorway. "Thank you." Garrick turned his head. His eyes swept over her, taking in the clean, dark waves of her hair, the high flush the hot water had brought to her pale cheeks, and the cautious defensive set of her shoulders. His jaw tightened, and she heard a faint, suppressed growl rumble deep in his chest. It wasn't a sound of anger. It was possession raw and heavy. He pointed to the heavy wooden table near the fire. A fresh pitcher of water and a plate of warm bread sat there. "Sit. You barely ate the fowl." She walked over, keeping the heavy oak table between them. She sat tearing a piece of bread and chewing it slowly. The silence stretched heavy, but not entirely uncomfortable. "You are waiting for the axe to fall." Garrick observed quietly. Gwyneth swallowed. "Experience has taught me that the warmer the fire, the sharper the knife hidden behind the host's back." A humorless smile touched the corner of Garrick's mouth. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. The firelight caught the jagged scar on his face, making him look savage. "I don't hide my knives, Gwyneth. If I wanted you dead, you would be dead. If I wanted you as a bedslave, you'd be in my bed. I told you what you are to me. A mate." She said the word like it tasted of ash. "I'm a human, Garrick. I will age and I will die while you remain exactly as you are. Your people despise my kind. We are tithes. We are labor. My people will respect what is mine." Garrick corrected his tone, hardening. "And you are not labor. As for time—" He paused, his gaze dropping to the floor before returning to her eyes. "A lycan's lifespan is tied to their mate. If you die, my wolf will mourn until it tears my heart to pieces. We share the years we have. That is the bond." Gwyneth stopped chewing. The gravity of his words settled over her like a suffocating blanket. He wasn't just offering her a crown or a bed. He was chaining his immortality to her fragile, mortal frame. It was a terrifying amount of power to hand to a girl who had spent her life completely powerless. "Why me?" she whispered. "Out of all the women in this world, you think I chose this—" Garrick let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through his hair. "For 10 years, my beast has been a corpse in my head. I thought it was gone. I wanted it gone. Then you stood in my courtyard, freezing, starving, surrounded by men who could snap your neck with 2 fingers, and you looked at me like I was the one who should be afraid." He stood up. He was too large for the room, his presence overwhelming. He walked slowly around the table, stopping beside her chair. Gwyneth stiffened, but she didn't shrink away. Garrick reached down his knuckles, lightly brushing against her shoulder. "You aren't cursed, Gwyneth. You're just a survivor. And God help me, so am I. We are going to survive this together." Morning in Ironhold was not heralded by birdsong, but by the ringing of steel in the training yards and the heavy thud of marching boots. The fortress was a machine of war, and its inhabitants were gears designed for violence. Gwyneth stood before the heavy oak doors of the great hall, her stomach twisting into painful knots. Garrick stood beside her, clad in dark leather armor, a heavy silver mantle draped over his broad shoulders. He looked every inch the ruthless conqueror the southern villages feared. "They will smell you before they see you." Garrick murmured, looking down at her. "They will know you are human. They will know I have claimed you. They will try to intimidate you. Let them try." Gwyneth said, her voice flat. She adjusted the cuffs of her tunic. "I've been spat on by better men." Garrick's mouth twitched. "Doubtful. But stay close." He pushed the doors open. The heavy hinges groaned, announcing their arrival. The great hall was cavernous, illuminated by high, clear-story windows and enormous iron chandeliers. Long wooden tables stretched across the stone floor, packed with hundreds of lycan soldiers, lords and ladies breaking their fast. The noise was deafening, a chaotic roar of laughter, clinking tankards and tearing meat. As Garrick stepped over the threshold, the noise died. It wasn't a gradual quiet. It was an instant suffocating silence that rolled through the room like a physical wave. Hundreds of heads turned. Hundreds of amber, gold, and green eyes locked onto the doorway. The collective inhale of the room was audible as the lycan court caught Gwyneth's scent. They smelled the mountain pine soap, yes. But beneath it they smelled the unmistakable, frail scent of human blood. and woven tightly into that scent was the heavy, dominating musk of their Alpha King. Garrick didn't hesitate. He placed a heavy hand on the small of Gwyneth's back, guiding her forward. They walked down the centre aisle toward the high table on the dais. The silence dragged on, thick with tension and unspoken outrage. Gwyneth kept her chin up. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, but she focused her eyes entirely on the empty carved wooden chair beside the king's seat. They reached the dais. Garrick pulled out the chair for her. She sat. Only then did the king take his own seat. Whispers broke out across the hall. Hissing, venomous sounds. A tall, broad-shouldered man with silver streaks in his dark hair stood up from a table near the front. He wore the velvet and fur trimmings of high nobility. His eyes were narrowed into dangerous slits. "Your Grace," the man said. His voice echoed clearly in the cavernous room. "It seems the quartermaster has made an error. A tithe has wandered out of the kitchens and onto the royal dais." Garrick didn't raise his voice, but it carried effortlessly. "There is no error, Lord Cailan." Cailan stepped away from his table, gesturing toward Gwyneth, with a look of profound disgust. "She is human Garrick, a southern mud scrubber. The air in this hall is fouled by her stench. Have you lost your mind to the winter frost?" Several other lords murmured in agreement, emboldened by Cailan's challenge. In Lycan society, an alpha was absolute, but weakness was a death sentence. Bringing a human tithe to the high table was a glaring vulnerability. Gwyneth looked at Cailan. She didn't see a terrifying wolf lord. She saw Harland the village elder. She saw the baker's brothers. She saw the same small-minded, arrogant fear she had dealt with her entire life. Bullies wore different clothes, but they always bled the same insecurity. Before Garrick could speak, Gwyneth reached for a silver goblet of water on the table, took a slow sip, and set it down. The clink of the metal was deafening in the tense hall. "My stench." Gwyneth asked, her voice calm and remarkably steady. "I scrubbed with pine soap this morning, my lord. If you smell foulness, I suggest you check your own boots. I hear the stables lack adequate mucking." A collective gasp rippled through the room. A human had just insulted a Lycan lord in front of the entire court. Cailan's face flushed a deep, violent purple. A feral snarl ripped from his throat, his teeth elongating into jagged fangs. "You insolent little meat!" He took a step toward the dais, his claws extending. He didn't take a second step. Garrick moved with a speed that defied physics. 1 second he was sitting, the next he was over the table, landing heavily on the stone floor right in front of Cailan. The king didn't just snarl, he unleashed a roar that shook the very foundation of the keep. The sound was pure, unadulterated primal fury. The pressure in the room dropped. Several lower-ranking Lycans fell to their knees, instantly clutching their ears, forced into submission by the sheer overwhelming weight of the Alpha's aura. Garrick grabbed Cailan by the throat, lifting the massive lord off his feet with one hand. Cailan choked his hands, clawing desperately at Garrick's iron grip. "You will address her as my queen." Garrick whispered, his voice vibrating with lethal intent. His eyes were no longer grey. They were burning, luminescent gold. The beast was entirely at the surface. "You will not look at her without permission. You will not breathe her air unless she allows it. If you disrespect my mate again, Cailan, I will tear your head from your shoulders and mount it on the gates for the crows." Garrick tightened his grip until Cailan's face began to turn blue, then tossed him away like a rag doll. Cailan crashed into a wooden table, splintering it to pieces. He scrambled to his knees, coughing violently, and bowed his head to the stone floor, exposing his neck in absolute surrender. Garrick turned, slowly sweeping his glowing eyes over the hundreds of stunned faces in the hall. "Does anyone else have an issue with the air in my hall?" Absolute silence. Not a single breath was heard. Garrick smoothed his leather armor, the gold fading from his eyes as he regained control. He walked calmly back up the dais and sat down beside Gwyneth. He picked up a piece of cured meat from a platter, took a bite, and looked at her. Eat, he said mildly. The cooks worked hard on it. Gwyneth looked at the battered lord on the floor, then at the terrified court, and finally at the man sitting beside her. For the first time in her life she realized she wasn't the one who needed to be afraid. Winter did not merely arrive at Ironhold. It laid siege to it. Frost crept up the massive granite walls, turning the fortress into a brutal, glittering monument against the grey sky. Inside the keep, a different kind of freeze had settled over the court. The lords and ladies of the northern wastes gave Gwyneth a wide berth. They bowed when she walked past, exposing their necks in rigid, resentful submission, but their eyes remained flat and calculating. Gwyneth found no comfort in their fear. Fear bred paranoia, and paranoia eventually sharpened into steel. She spent her days in the Royal Archives, a cavernous circular room buried deep in the southern wing. It smelled of decaying vellum-dry cedar and ancient ink. It was almost always empty. Lycans preferred the blunt honesty of a sparring ring to the quiet pages of history. For Gwyneth, it was a sanctuary. Knowledge had always been a weapon she was denied. Now she had an entire arsenal at her fingertips. Garrick found her there on their 7th day together. He moved silently for a man of his size, his heavy boots making no sound on the woven rugs. Gwyneth didn't look up from the heavy, leather-bound tome spread open on the oak table. She didn't need to. The sudden rush of warmth in the freezing room and the scent of ozone and pine told her everything. "You skipped the midday meal," Garrick observed. He pulled out a heavy chair and sat heavily. The wood groaned under his weight. He looked exhausted. The deep circles bruising the skin under his grey eyes spoke of endless councils and restless nights spent pacifying outraged lords. "I wasn't hungry," Gwyneth replied, turning a brittle page. "You are always hungry." He counted softly. He reached across the table, sliding a wrapped bundle of cured venison and sharp cheese over the parchment. "Eat. You're fading away in here." Gwyneth paused, staring at the food. She slowly unwrapped the linen cloth and took a piece of the meat. She chewed mechanically, her eyes dropping back to the text. Garrick leaned his forearms on the table, trying to catch her gaze. "What are you reading that is so vital you'd rather freeze in the dark than sit by the hearth in our chambers?" "I am reading about my own execution," she said bluntly. She pushed the massive book toward him, tapping a worn, heavily inked paragraph. "The Alpha's bond is absolute. Should the mate perish, the wolf perishes. The mind shatters, the beast consumes the man, and the Alpha falls to madness before death claims him entirely." Garrick looked at the text. His jaw tightened, the jagged scar on his cheek pulling taut. He didn't say a word. "You didn't tell me," Gwyneth said, her voice eerily calm. "You told me you would mourn. You didn't tell me my death would literally kill you." "It doesn't matter," Garrick rasped, looking away. "It is the only thing that matters." Gwyneth slammed her hand flat against the table. The sharp crack echoed in the silent room. "I thought they hated me because I am human, because I am a southern peasant, but that isn't it at all, is it? They hate me because I am a structural weakness. I am a fatal flaw in their invincible king. If I catch a fever, the northern wastes lose their ruler. If I slip on the ice, the kingdom falls into a succession war." She stood up, pacing a tight circle behind her chair. Her breathing grew shallow. "I am a walking target, Garrick. Lord Calen doesn't just want me gone for his pride. He wants me gone so he can take your crown when you lose your mind." Garrick stood slowly. He closed the gap between them in 2 long strides, trapping her against the edge of the table. He didn't touch her, but his massive frame served as a cage, forcing her to stop pacing and look up at him. "Calen will do nothing," Garrick said, his voice vibrating with absolute authority. "No one in this keep will lay a hand on you. You are heavily guarded. Captain Cedric stands at your door every hour I am not with you. Guards can be bribed." She shot back, her cynicism acting as a shield against the sheer terror of her reality. "Steel rusts. People look away. I have survived this long because I relied on no one but myself. Now my mere existence is a threat to an entire nation of monsters. How do I survive that? Garrick reached out his large hands, gripping her shoulders. His thumbs rubbed soothing circles into her tense muscles. The ferocious Alpha King vanished, leaving behind only a desperately tired man holding on to his anchor. By trusting me, he whispered. I know it goes against every instinct you have, Gwyneth. I know the world has taught you to expect the knife in the dark. But you are mine. I will burn Ironhold to the ground and build a new kingdom on its ashes before I let a single hair on your head be harmed. Do you understand? Gwyneth stared into his grey eyes. The gold was entirely absent. This wasn't the beast claiming its mate. This was a man begging for her trust. She felt the rigid defensive walls around her heart crack. She didn't want to rely on him. It was terrifying to need someone. But as she stood in the freezing archives, wrapped in the heat of his towering presence, she realized she was already leaning into him. She raised her hand, her bruised fingers tracing the jagged scar along his jaw. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch, with a vulnerability that stole her breath. Okay, she breathed. I trust you. He exhaled a long, shuddering breath, pulling her against his chest. He buried his face in her hair, simply holding her in the quiet dark. It wasn't a romantic fairy tale. It was two scarred survivors standing in the ruins of their pasts, silently agreeing to face the coming storm together. Treachery rarely announces itself with war horns. It creeps in through cracked windows, rides on whispered promises, and waits for a moment of quiet distraction. 3 days after Gwyneth made her peace with the mate Bond, Garrick was forced to ride east. A border skirmish with a rogue pack demanded the Alpha's immediate and brutal intervention. He left behind 50 of his best men, placing Captain Cedric in absolute command of the Queen's safety. The keep felt impossibly vast and hollow without Garrick's suffocating grounding presence. Gwyneth stayed in the royal wing, reading and rationing her movements. On the second night of his absence, the heavy iron radiators in the Royal Solar went ice-cold. Gwyneth woke shivering her breath, pluming in the dark air. She wrapped herself in a thick wolf-pelt blanket and walked to the door. She expected to find Cedric stationed in the corridor. Instead, the hallway was empty. The iron sconces holding the torches had been extinguished. Her survival instincts, honed by years of starvation and cruelty in Oak Hill, flared instantly. A broken boiler was an accident. An empty guard post and extinguished lights were an ambush. She didn't call out. Calling out revealed your position. She slipped back into the Solar, pulled on her thick wool trousers, laced her heavy leather boots, and grabbed the only weapon available, a heavy iron fireplace poker. A sharp scrape of metal against stone echoed from the lower stairwell. They were coming up. Gwyneth knew she couldn't fight Lycan warriors. They would snap her iron poker like a dry twig. Her only advantage was the dark, and the fact that they expected a terrified, weeping human. They expected a victim. She slipped out the secondary servant's door, a narrow passage Garrick had shown her that led down to the kitchens. She moved quickly, her boots making soft, rhythmic thuds against the stone. She descended 2 flights, aiming for the heavily populated barracks, where a blatant assassination would be impossible. As she pushed open the heavy oak door leading to the central courtyard, she froze. The courtyard was deserted, bathed in the sickly, pale light of a half-moon. But the massive iron gate leading down to the lower pens, the dungeon where feral Lycans, who had permanently lost their human minds, were kept, was wide open. Standing in the center of the frosted cobblestones was a nightmare. It was a Lycan stuck in its beast form, but twisted. Its fur was matted and falling out in ragged clumps. It was emaciated, its ribs protruding sharply beneath its ruined skin. Yellow, glowing eyes locked on to Gwyneth. Saliva dripped from jaws that could easily crush a war horse's femur. Up on the high balcony overlooking the courtyard, Gwyneth caught a glimpse of movement. A shadow wrapped in a velvet cloak. Lord Corvin Kaelin's closest ally. He wasn't going to murder the Queen and risk the Alpha's wrath. He was going to let a feral beast tear her apart in a tragic accident caused by a left-open gate. The feral wolf snarled a wet, rattling sound that vibrated in Gwyneth's chest. It crouched its powerful hind legs, coiling to spring. Panic screamed in her brain. "Run!" Gwyneth locked her knees. She gripped the iron poker tightly, not to strike, but to keep her hands from shaking. She knew wild dogs. She had survived the feral packs that roamed the southern woods during the famine. Running triggered the prey drive. If she ran, she was meat. "I see you," Gwyneth said. Her voice was barely a whisper, but in the dead silence of the frozen courtyard it carried. The beast paused, confused by the lack of screaming. Gwyneth stood completely still. She didn't shrink away. She squared her shoulders, holding the heavy pelt cloak wide to make herself look larger. She stared directly into the beast's glowing yellow eyes, projecting an absolute, unyielding calm she didn't truly feel. "You are hungry," she said, her voice dropping an octave, steadying into a rhythmic, soothing cadence. "I know what it means to starve. It burns. It eats you from the inside out." The feral wolf took a slow, stalking step forward. Its nose twitched. It smelled her fear, but it also smelled the overwhelming territorial scent of the Alpha King embedded in her clothes. The conflicting signals paralyzed its attack instinct. Gwyneth slowly reached into the deep pocket of her cloak. She pulled out the heavy lump of cured venison she had wrapped up from the archives days ago. She had kept it out of habit, a peasant's reflex to never throw away food. She tossed the meat onto the frost-covered stones. It landed with a dull thud halfway between them. The beast's eyes snapped to the food. It whined a pitiful, broken sound that contrasted sharply with its monstrous appearance. It lunged forward, snapping up the frozen meat in one bite, swallowing it whole. It looked back at her, licking its blood-stained chops. It was still hungry. It took another step toward her. Gwyneth raised the iron poker, pointing it directly at the beast's snout. She didn't flinch. "No," she commanded, channeling every ounce of authority Garrick used in the Great Hall. The beast stopped. It lowered its massive head, its ears flattening against its skull. It wasn't submitting to her. It was submitting to the ghost of the Alpha that clung to her skin and to the sheer audacity of a creature that refused to act like prey. The feral wolf let out a low huff, turned, and trotted slowly back towards the open gate of the pens, searching for more scraps. Gwyneth stood frozen for 3 full minutes until she heard the heavy clanking of armored men flooding the courtyard. Captain Cedric burst from the stairwell, his sword drawn, his eyes wild with panic. He saw Gwyneth standing alone in the moonlight, the open pen gate, and the enormous fresh claw marks on the stones. He dropped to his knees in the frost, bowing his head completely. "My queen, I was lured away. A false message from the Outer Watch. I swear my life is yours to take." Gwyneth didn't look at the trembling captain. She slowly raised her chin, her eyes fixing on the high balcony. Lord Corvin was still standing there, frozen in shock, staring down at the human woman who had just stared down death and won. Gwyneth didn't shout. She didn't accuse him. She simply looked at Corvin, raised the iron poker, and tapped it once deliberately against the cobblestones. "I know." Corvin stepped back into the shadows and vanished. Gwyneth lowered the iron bar. She was shaking so violently her teeth rattled, but as Cedric scrambled to his feet to escort her back inside, she felt a grim satisfaction settle over her. They wanted to prove she was a fragile, useless human. Instead, she had just shown the court of monsters that she belonged in the dark just as much as they did. Horns echoed through the jagged peaks, signaling the Alpha's return long before his vanguard breached the tree line. Ironhold stirred from its tense slumber gates, groaning open to admit the weary, battle-hardened soldiers. Gwyneth stood on the high balcony overlooking the main courtyard. She wore a heavy cloak of black fur, her hands resting on the frozen stone parapet. She watched as Garrick rode through the gates. He looked exhausted. His armor was dented, his dark hair plastered to his forehead with sweat and grime and his massive black war-horse favoured its left front leg. He was barking orders to his lieutenants, dividing the spoils and directing the wounded to the healers. Then he stopped. Garrick didn't look up immediately. His chest expanded as he drew in a deep breath of the freezing mountain air. Gwyneth watched his entire posture shift. The exhaustion vanished, replaced instantly by a rigid, terrifying tension. His head snapped up. His eyes, glowing a lethal, brilliant gold, locked onto her from 100 yards away. He smelled it. Even buried under the scent of pine soap, wood smoke, and cold, the acute senses of the Alpha picked up the lingering, sour stench of the feral beast that had been near her. He smelled the ghost of her adrenaline. He smelled a threat. Garrick vaulted off his horse before it had completely stopped moving. He didn't issue another order. He shoved past his own men, his heavy boots pounding against the cobblestones as he made a straight line for the keep's entrance. Gwyneth retreated into the royal solar, leaving the balcony doors cracked open. She barely had time to stand by the hearth before the heavy oak doors were thrown open with such force that one of the iron hinges cracked. Garrick stood in the doorway, chest heaving. He looked wild, half shifted his claws fully extended and tearing into the leather grips of his gauntlets. He crossed the room in 3 strides, dropping to his knees in front of her. He pulled her against his chest, burying his face in her neck, inhaling her scent in ragged, desperate gasps. "Who?" Garrick rumbled. It wasn't a question. It was a death sentence waiting for a name. "I am unharmed," Gwyneth said quietly, weaving her fingers into his hair to ground him. "I handled it." Garrick pulled back just enough to look at her. His golden eyes were frantic, searching her face for any hidden injury. "You smell like the lower pens. You smell like a rotting feral. I left you for 3 days, Gwyneth. Tell me exactly what happened before I start tearing this castle apart stone by stone," she told him. She didn't embellish, nor did she downplay the danger. She recounted the dead radiators, the missing guards, the open gate, and the beast in the courtyard. When she spoke Lord Corvin's name, the temperature in the room seemed to drop by 10 degrees. Garrick stood up slowly. The frantic energy of his wolf solidified into a cold, calculated fury. "Cedric!" He roared toward the open hallway. Captain Cedric appeared instantly, his face pale. "Sire, arrest Lord Corvin. Drag him to the Great Hall. Summon the entire court." Garrick didn't raise his voice, which made the command infinitely more terrifying. "If any man tries to stand in your way, gut him." "Wait," Gwyneth interjected. She stepped forward, catching Garrick's wrist. "You cannot just execute him." Garrick stared at her, genuinely confused. "He tried to have you torn apart. I am going to rip his heart out of his chest and feed it to the hounds, and prove to them exactly what they already believe." Gwyneth squeezed his wrist, her voice fiercely practical. "They think you are a slave to the mate bond. They think you are acting irrationally because of a human. If you murder a highborn lord in a fit of rage without a trial, you validate their fears. You give them a martyr. You give them a reason to rebel." Garrick's jaw tightened. "I am the king. My word is law. A king who rules entirely by fear eventually finds a dagger in his back," Gwyneth countered, dropping his hand. She walked over to the heavy oak table and picked up a rolled parchment. "I did not spend the last 3 days cowering in your chambers, Garrick. I read the ancient laws. I read the unbroken codes of the northern wastes. Let me handle Corvin." An hour later, the great hall was packed to the rafters. The silence was thick, suffocating, and entirely different from the silence that had greeted Gwyneth on her first day. This was the silence of a trapped animal, realizing the cage was locked. Lord Corvin was forced to his knees before the dais. His velvet cloak was torn, and his lip was bleeding from where Cedric had struck him for resisting. He looked up at Garrick, his eyes flashing with desperate defiance. Garrick sat on his carved wooden seat, completely motionless. His eyes were dark grey, entirely devoid of the feral gold. He looked every inch the rational, composed monarch. He leaned back and gestured to the chair beside him. Gwyneth stood up. She didn't wear a crown, but the heavy black fur resting on her shoulders and the glacial calm in her eyes commanded absolute attention. She walked to the edge of the dais, looking down at the kneeling lord. Lord Corvin. Gwyneth began, her voice carrying effortlessly through the cavernous hall. You are accused of treason. You plotted to assassinate your queen by luring her into the courtyard and releasing a feral beast from the lower pens. Corvin sneered, baring his teeth. Lies spat from a southern peasant. Where is your proof a broken boiler is an accident? An open gate is a careless guard. You survived because you hid like a rat. You have no witnesses. You cannot kill a lord of the court on the paranoid word of a human. Murmurs rippled through the hall. Corvin was right. Without proof, an execution would be seen as pure tyranny. Gwyneth let the murmurs build before she raised a hand, silencing the room instantly. You are correct, Lord Corvin. There were no witnesses, and a human's word carries little weight against a lycan's pride. She stepped down from the dais, walking slowly until she stood only a few feet from him. However, the ancient code of your own ancestors, written by the first Alphas, states that a lycan accused of treachery without mortal witness may prove his innocence through the trial of the beast. If the accused can survive a night in the lower pens unarmed, the gods have found him innocent. Corvin's face lost all its color. The arrogant sneer vanished, replaced by stark, undisguised terror. To be thrown into the feral pens unarmed was a guaranteed, agonizing death. You cannot invoke the old laws, Corvin stammered, looking frantically past her to Garrick. Your Grace, this is madness. She is mocking our traditions. Garrick leaned forward, resting his chin on his knuckles. A dark, terrifying smile touched his lips. The Queen has read the archives, Corvin. The law is clear. You demanded proof, or you demanded justice. She has offered you a path to clear your name. Will you take it? I am a highborn lord. Corvin screamed, struggling against the guards holding his arms. I will not be fed to mindless animals because a human whore got frightened in the dark. Gwyneth didn't flinch. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that only Corvin and the closest guards could hear. I wasn't frightened, Corvin. I looked the beast in the eye and it walked away. Let's see if your highborn blood buys you the same mercy. She turned her back on him and walked calmly up the stairs of the dais. Captain Cedric, she commanded, taking her seat. Take him to the pens. Seal the gates until dawn. Corvin screamed as he was dragged backward out of the hall. He cursed her name, cursed the king, and begged for mercy, his voice echoing off the stone walls until the heavy doors slammed shut behind him. The court stared at Gwyneth in absolute shock. She hadn't just defeated her enemy, she had weaponized their own laws against them. She had proven herself more ruthless, more calculating, and far more dangerous than any pampered aristocrat in the room. Garrick reached across the armrest, taking her hand in his. He lifted it to his lips, pressing a kiss against her bruised knuckles in front of the entire assembly. It was a clear, unmistakable message. She was not a pet. She was the queen of the northern wastes, and she had just bared her fangs. Ice began to crack along the southern parapets, 3 weeks later, yielding to the slow, stubborn arrival of spring. The mountain snowpack turned to rushing waterfalls, the sound filling the fortress with a constant thunderous roar. Corvin did not survive the night in the pens. His death shifted the tectonic plates of power within Ironhold. The resentment in the court did not entirely vanish, but it was buried under a thick, impenetrable layer of profound respect. They no longer bowed to Gwyneth merely because they feared Garrick's wrath. They bowed because they feared her intellect. They recognized that the king was the sword, but the queen was the hand that aimed it. Gwyneth spent the transition of the seasons overhauling the kingdom's logistics. She sat in the archives, surrounded by maps and ledgers, dismantling the archaic tithe system that had nearly cost her her life. She replaced the demand for human flesh with agricultural taxes, imposing heavy tariffs on villages that failed to meet crop quotas. Oak Hill, her former home, was subjected to a rigorous taxation schedule. She didn't burn her old village to the ground. She simply ensured they would spend the next decade paying for their cowardice in grain and coin. It was a cold, pragmatic vengeance that the Lycan lords found deeply satisfying. Late one evening, Garrick found her asleep at the heavy oak desk in their solar. Her cheek was resting against a sprawling map of the southern trade routes, her ink-stained fingers still clutching a quill. He moved quietly, pulling the quill from her grasp and wiping the ink from her fingers with a cloth. He gently scooped her up, lifting her into his arms. Gwyneth stirred, sighing heavily as she instinctively curled into his chest, seeking his overwhelming warmth. "You work harder than my generals," Garrick murmured, carrying her toward the massive fur-lined bed. "Your generals are idiots," she mumbled against his tunic, her eyes still closed. "They leave the supply lines completely exposed in the eastern valleys. Someone has to fix it." Garrick chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound that vibrated against her cheek. He laid her down on the mattress, pulling the thick pelts over her shoulders. He sat on the edge of the bed, reaching out to brush a stray lock of dark hair behind her ear. "They called you cursed," Garrick said softly, staring at her face in the dim light of the hearth. Gwyneth opened her eyes. The exhaustion in her bones was heavy, but the old sharp cynicism was gone, washed away by months of surviving and conquering. "And what do they call me now? A terror." Garrick smiled, the gold flickering warmly in his grey eyes. "A brilliant, terrifying nightmare. Lord Calen crossed the street yesterday just to avoid walking past your carriage in the lower town." Gwyneth let out a quiet laugh. She reached up, resting her palm against his jaw, her thumb tracing the familiar, jagged scar. "Good. Fear keeps them polite." "Are you happy, Gwyneth?" The question caught her off guard. It was an incredibly human, vulnerable thing for the Alpha King to ask. He wasn't asking if she felt secure or if she felt powerful. He was asking if the cage she had walked into had somehow become a home. She looked at the man who had pulled her out of the mud. She thought of the immortal years stretching out before them, a terrifying expanse of time filled with wars, politics, and the relentless cold of the north. But then she looked at his eyes anchored entirely to her burning, with a love so profound it defied logic. "I survived a plague starvation and the hatred of my own people." Gwyneth whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I spent my whole life thinking survival was the only thing that mattered. But surviving isn't living. You gave me a reason to stop fighting the dark, Garrick. You gave me a reason to rule it." Garrick leaned down, pressing his lips to hers. It was not a desperate feral claim like the ones in the beginning. It was a slow, deliberate promise. The mate bond hummed between them, a living, breathing tether forged in ice and iron. She was never cursed. She was simply a weapon waiting for the right war. And as the Alpha King held her in the quiet dark of the fortress, the world outside knew the truth. The northern wastes had not just taken a tithe, they had crowned a survivor, and she would never let them fall. If you enjoyed this tale of survival loyalty and a love forged in the harshest of winters, please show your support. Hit that like button to let the algorithm know you want more dark-grounded romance. Share this video with friends who crave stories where the heroine saves herself, using her mind, not just magic. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our upcoming epic sagas. Drop a comment below telling us what you thought of Gwyneth's revenge, and what kind of story we should tell next.